The community college washout. That's what they were calling her by the third week. Katie Rodriguez arrived at St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah on a Tuesday in August, carrying a cardboard box and a resume that made the hiring director squint. The box contained a cracked NASA mug, a dying succulent that hadn't seen sunlight in 3 years, and a photograph she would never show anyone. Her credentials were solid: nursing degree, 5 years experience, clean record, but something about her didn't register as threatening. She was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made people forget she was in the room until they needed something, and by then she was already moving toward them. St. Michael's occupied for city blocks in the historic district, all Spanish moss and brick facades. Inside, the air smelled like antiseptic and old linoleum, the fluorescent lights overhead humming their endless mechanical prayer. Night shifts were Katie's preference. She'd requested them during the interview, and the director, a woman named Patterson who'd been running the ED for 14 years, had simply nodded and made a note. Night shifts meant fewer administrators walking the halls. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions about where she'd actually trained or why her references were so careful with their words, choosing each one as if it might be used in court. 6 months in, nobody knew her first name. They called her Rodriguez. Or the new nurse. Or, if Dr. Mercer was in earshot and feeling theatrical, the community college washout. The hospital's cardiothoracic unit occupied the West Wing, where patients went to have their chests cracked open and their hearts rebuilt by men who believed they were closer to God than the rest of humanity. Dr. Mercer had been the top surgeon there for 11 years. He dressed the part: Italian wool, cologne that smelled like ambition, a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a warning. His hands were steady. His outcomes were excellent. His bedside manner was surgical in a different way, precise cuts delivered with a smile. Katie had avoided being alone with him since June. On a Thursday morning in late February, the admission board showed a new transfer: Colonel James Halloway, 64, post-op cardiac bypass, secondary wound infection suspected. The chart came with a red flag. High-value patient. Military background. Ensure continuity of care. Patterson had assigned Katie to the case before the colonel was even in the elevator. The man who arrived in the wheelchair looked like he'd been repaired more than once. His face was weathered the way faces become when they've spent years in places where the sun doesn't soften anything, just burns down in a flat, punishing glare. His sternum was wrapped. His surgical wound was healing clean. But his left anterior chest, just below the main incision, showed the kind of inflammation that made Katie's pulse quicken. Erythema spreading outward. Warmth. The early signature of infection moving deeper. Dr. Mercer swept through on rounds at 8:24 a.m., coffee in hand, 3 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. He glanced at the colonel's chest, made a note, moved on. Monitor it. For antibiotics. We'll reassess in 3 days. Katie was changing the colonel's dressing when Dr. Mercer left the room. The infection was already burrowing. 3 days would be too long. She'd seen infections like this before, seen them move from inflammatory to systemic in 18 hours, seen patients crash at 3 a.m. when the duty residents were too tired to recognize sepsis. She didn't speak about this to Dr. Mercer. She simply worked. The wound debridement started at 9:15. Katie gathered her supplies: sterile gauze, saline flush, a 4x4 pad, her trauma shears hanging from a blue cord around her neck. The shears were old. Decades old. They'd been used in a field hospital in Cunha province, passed from medic to medic, their handles worn smooth by hands that had learned to move without thinking. The colonel watched her arrange the instruments. Those Leathermen. His voice was rough, like gravel in a coffee can. Lister bandage scissors, Katie said. Not a lie. Not quite the truth. She was already pulling on gloves, and her movements were economical, no wasted motion, each gesture flowing into the next like water finding its path. She'd done this 10,000 times. Not in a hospital. Not with a heart monitor beeping overhead. But the hands remembered. Muscle memory operated at a level beneath conscious thought. She began debriding the secondary wound with surgical precision. The infected tissue came away clean. Her fingers were steady. Her eyes tracked the perimeter of healthy tissue. The Colonel's eyes tracked her hands. The hiss of the saline flush. The sound of old instruments moving through practiced geometry. The monitor's steady rhythm, beep, beep, beep. Everything in the room narrowed down to the work. And then the Colonel whispered, "Hindu Kush, 2019. Katie's hand stilled. Just for 1 second. Just long enough that anyone watching would have seen it, but everyone watching was focused on the wall clock or their phones or the coffee in their hands. She looked up. Their eyes met. The Colonel's were the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, and they held the look of someone recognizing something that had been hidden. She gave the smallest nod. Not enough for anyone else to catch. Not enough to be a confirmation. Just enough to say, "I hear you." The Colonel reached for his jacket, folded on the bedside chair. His fingers found the lining and touched something inside, a faded patch, maybe 2 inches across, embroidered with unit insignia. His hand trembled slightly as he let his fingers rest there, and Katie understood. Understood that he was recognizing the same patch that was sewn inside her own scrub jacket, pinned under the collar where no one could see it. The same unit. The same 2019 deployment. The same Hindu Kush, where the mountains turned gold at sunset and the dust got into everything and changed you at a cellular level. Katie finished the debridement. She dressed the wound with fresh gauze, taped it down, and stepped back. "Infections localized," she said quietly. Her voice was the voice she used with everyone, polite, almost deferential, the voice of someone who understood her place in the hierarchy. "Needs to come out. Today." "I'll call Dr. Mercer," the Colonel said. "You will." It was the smallest command, delivered as softly as wind moving through grass. The Colonel heard it anyway. He nodded and picked up the call button. But that wasn't what caught Dr. Mercer's attention when he returned to the room 3 minutes later. What caught his attention was the way the Colonel looked at Katie. The way his hand kept returning to the faded patch inside his jacket. The way Katie's jaw was clenched, not in fear or stress, but in the kind of disciplined restraint that only came from someone who'd learned, a long time ago, to lock everything down. Dr. Mercer watched her gather her instruments. Watched her hang the trauma shears back around her neck, casual and easy, the way someone might wear a stethoscope. Watched her leave the room without saying anything else. "That patch," he said to the Colonel, his voice casual. "Military." "Long time ago," the Colonel said. But something in Mercer's face had shifted. A tightness around the eyes. A recalibration. He went to the nurse's station at 9:52 a.m. and pulled Katie Rodriguez's personnel file from the computer because he was the kind of man who needed to understand what had just happened, and he was the kind of man who believed that everything important could be found in a file. The tap of her badge against the metal cart. The whisper of saline rushing through sterile gauze. The Colonel's hand touching the patch, trembling with something that wasn't pain. These were the sounds that would, months later, echo through the hospital's atrium. These were the moments that changed everything. But nobody knew that yet. The next morning, Dr. Mercer arrived at St. Michael's before sunrise. He moved through the corridors with the precision of someone executing a plan. By the time the day shift filtered in at 6:30, he had already positioned himself at the nursing station, his voice carrying just loud enough for 3 separate conversations to pivot toward Katie Rodriguez's credibility. "You know," he said to the charge nurse, clipboard in hand, "I've been reviewing her file. Community college backgrounds are fine for certain facilities, but St. Michael's has always maintained higher standards. Her references are oddly vague. Nobody at her previous employer seems to remember specifics." He tapped his pen against his lips, the gesture theatrical. "I'm just concerned we may have missed something during onboarding." The charge nurse, a woman named Sandra who'd worked cardiac for 16 years, shifted her weight. "She seems competent." "Competence and credentials are different things," Mercer replied smoothly. "One can be performed." One cannot be faked. Usually. By 7 o'clock, the seed was planted. By noon, it had germinated into a thing with roots. Katie felt the shift before she saw it. During rounds on the cardiac unit, residents stopped asking her questions. The techs who usually nodded hello now offered tight smiles and quick turns. Dr. Mercer moved through patient rooms with her at his side, but his commentary changed. Where he'd once ignored her, now he corrected everything. Her vital sign documentation. Her 4 placements. Her tone of voice when speaking to patients, perhaps a bit presumptuous for someone in your position, he said within earshot of a 74-year-old with stage 4 heart failure. Katie documented each interaction in her mind. Not with anger. With precision. The same way she'd catalogued threats in Kandahar. The break room became a different kind of war zone. It started on Wednesday afternoon. Katie entered carrying her lunch, a container of rice and grilled chicken, prepared the night before with the efficiency of someone who'd eaten in field hospitals and learned never to waste resources. She opened the refrigerator. The hum of the appliance seemed impossibly loud. She settled at the table nearest the window, the one that overlooked the parking lot and the live oaks beyond, their branches heavy with Spanish moss like the weight of secrets. Dr. Mercer walked in 5 minutes later. He didn't acknowledge her. He moved to the coffee station, poured a cup, and said to nobody in particular, but loud enough for the room to hear, "Fascinating how people present themselves one way during interviews and reveal something entirely different once hired. The chameleon strategy. I read a fascinating piece about credential fraud in healthcare. The financial implications alone are staggering." A resident from the teaching program glanced at Katie. Then away. Quickly. 3 minutes later, she was alone. The next day, it happened again. Saturday. Within 7 minutes, the room emptied. A phlebotomist gathered her belongings with exaggerated care. An intern muttered something about needing to check on a patient. The attending physician stood, stretched, and left without a word. Katie ate her lunch. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound like insects trapped in plastic. She did not look up. She did not react. She finished every bite. By Friday, people stopped coming to the break room when she was there. They took their lunches to offices, to stairwells, to parked cars in the sweltering Savannah heat. Katie became a kind of contagion. Competence did not matter when proximity meant contamination. That was when Mercer escalated. It was a Tuesday morning during rounds when the colonel's condition remained stable but closely monitored. Katie was checking his post-operative wound site, the skin around the surgical line pale but clean, healing with the efficiency of someone whose body remembered how to repair itself under pressure. Dr. Mercer arrived with his team, 2 residents, a medical student, and an attending cardiologist who looked profoundly uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. In the hallway outside room for 12, a family waited. The colonel's ex-wife, his daughter from his first marriage, his sister who'd driven in from Jacksonville. They stood in that particular configuration of grief that comes from watching someone you love become fragile. The daughter held a folder of discharge papers. Everyone was nervous. Everyone was tired. Dr. Mercer stepped out of the room and positioned himself in front of them with a kind of authority that came from knowing nobody would question his presence in the space he occupied. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, "not nurse," Katie noticed. "Never nurse anymore." A moment. She stepped into the hallway. The family watched. "I've been meaning to discuss your background," Mercer continued, his voice pitched low enough to seem confidential but high enough to carry. "Your credentials have been concerning me. I've made some phone calls. Interesting what you learn when you actually verify things rather than taking applications at face value." He gestured toward the folder the daughter held. "These families trust us with their loved ones. They expect the people handling their care to actually have the qualifications they claim." The sister's eyes widened slightly. "Did you actually attend an accredited nursing program?" Mercer asked. "Or did your references come from a strip mall operation? Because I'm having difficulty confirming your background, and frankly, at this point, I'm wondering if you fabricated the entire application. The silence was the kind that happens in hospitals when monitors are silenced and ventilators pause and the world briefly forgets to breathe. The daughter pulled her mother closer. The sister's face shifted through expressions, surprise, doubt, then something like suspicion. Katie crossed her arms. Her posture was neutral. Her face was a blank slate. Her eyes were steady on his, the way a sniper holds a target in crosshairs. She did not flinch. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She stood there while his voice rose slightly, while he elaborated on the gaps in her file, while he performed his concern like an actor who'd rehearsed the role in his head 100 times. His face reddened. His jaw tightened. Words spilled out, concerns about scope of practice, questions about competency, insinuations about how she'd somehow passed the NCLEX when so many qualified candidates failed. She waited until his voice went hoarse. Until the anger had burned through the oxygen in his chest and left him gasping slightly. Until the family's doubt had been planted and fertilized and left to grow. Then Katie spoke, her voice pitched at a frequency that made everyone in the hallway refocus. It was quiet. It was calm. It was a voice that had given orders across Rotorwash and through gunfire and in rooms where people were dying. When you're done performing, Dr. Mercer, there's a patient in 4B who actually needs attention. His oxygen saturation is trending down. Recommend you check before the attending rounds. She paused. Sir. She turned and walked past him with enough proximity that he had to step back. Her shoulder nearly brushed his arm. He retreated with the kind of instinctive movement that comes from someone reading danger in the body language of another human, even if that human was a woman in scrubs. The ex-wife and daughter and sister watched her return to the colonel's room. They watched her move with absolute confidence. They watched her place her hand on the patient's shoulder with the gentle certainty of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Then they looked back at Dr. Mercer, whose color had not yet returned to normal. That night, he documented the interaction in his own way. The next morning, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the nursing station. It was printed on official St. Michael's letterhead, dated and signed by Dr. Mercer himself. The text cited insubordination and overstepping scope of practice by a staff nurse who had corrected a physician's dosage order in front of trainees. The incident reference was from 3 days prior, when Katie had quietly pointed out that Dr. Mercer had written an order for 80 milligrams of digoxin instead of 8. The medication would have stopped the colonel's heart. She'd caught it before he'd signed the medication administration record. She'd caught it, and now she'd been documented as insubordinate for doing so. Dr. Mercer walked past the board while several staff members were reading it. He did not look at Katie, but he spoke anyway, his voice carrying across the station like a public address system. Community college graduates often don't understand the hierarchical structure of a hospital, he said to no one and everyone. They think they're physicians. They think they can question orders. It's actually quite predictable. The washout playing doctor syndrome. I've seen it before. Katie read the write-up without expression. The words seemed to exist on the paper as if they'd been written in a language she didn't speak. She understood the mechanics, the letters, the punctuation, the official seal. But the emotional weight of them slid off her like water off waxed canvas. She returned to her medication cart. She continued her rounds. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She did not retreat to a supply closet to process the cascade of implications. She moved through her afternoon with the same precision she'd used in operating theaters where the only difference between saved lives and lost ones was a 3-second decision made under catastrophic pressure. But that night, when the hospital grew quiet and the night shift settled into its own rhythm, the colonel asked her to check his blood pressure. She placed the cuff on his arm, waited for the numbers, and he watched her face with the intensity of someone trained to read people across languages and cultures and fundamental barriers to understanding. "You're not just a nurse, are you?" he asked quietly. Katie was silent for long enough that her silence became an answer. "I can't discuss it, sir," she finally said. The colonel nodded. He understood compartmentalization. He understood the things that could not be spoken aloud. He understood the price of secrets kept in plain sight. "Mercer's making calls," the colonel said after a long pause. "I overheard him yesterday on the phone. Board members. Something about credential verification. He's building a case. Whatever you're actually doing here, Captain," and his use of her true rank, spoken at barely above a whisper, sent a current through the room. "It's running out of time." Katie checked her secure phone that night, the one with the encrypted messaging system, the one that connected her to her handler at a JSOC command center in Northern Virginia. The response came back in 4 minutes. "The investigation is 90% complete. The procurement officer's financial records are documented. 2 more weeks and we have everything. Hold position." She had 2 more weeks. Dr. Mercer made his move the next morning before she arrived for shift. He called the Director of Human Resources at 6:45 a.m. He requested an external investigation into credential irregularities. He mentioned his concerns about the nursing application. He suggested that given her performance issues, it might be wise to verify everything. Just to be thorough. Just to protect the hospital. Then he made 3 separate phone calls to board members. In each conversation, he positioned himself as the concerned physician who'd noticed inconsistencies. He spoke with the tone of someone who didn't want to make trouble but couldn't in good conscience stay silent. He suggested that the hospital's hiring practices might have been compromised. He contacted her previous employers with carefully worded questions designed to sound like professional courtesy while seeding doubt. When they confirmed her employment, he thanked them warmly and then asked follow-up questions that suggested there were concerns. When they asked what kind of concerns, he demurred. "Just verifying," he said. "Just being thorough." By the time Katie arrived at 7 a.m., the machinery of institutional doubt was already grinding into motion. The rest would follow with the inevitability of gravity. 3 nights later, the monitor screaming was the sound of a man's lung collapsing. Katie was in the medication room on the 3rd floor, cross-referencing a discharge order against the pharmacy printout, when the alarm cut through the hospital's midnight quiet like a saw blade through bone. Not the gentle warning beep of a patient sitting up too fast. Not the casual alert of a dropped oxygen saturation that would climb back on its own. This was the code blue tone, the one that meant someone's heart was failing or their breathing was stopping or both were happening at once. She didn't look up. In 6 months at St. Michael's, she'd learned that every nurse on the floor moved toward that sound like iron filings to a magnet. She would get her answers in 30 seconds. The second alarm came 14 seconds later. She moved. The medication room door swung open before she was fully through it, her feet already moving down the corridor toward the ICU. No running. Running triggered attention, questions, protocols about chain of command. Katie walked with purpose, the kind of stride that belonged there, the kind that suggested she already knew where she was going. Her scrubs were dark blue. Her badge hung at shoulder height. Her hands were steady because steady hands were the only hands that mattered when someone was dying. Room for 12. The colonel's room. The moment she reached the doorway, she understood the geometry of the crisis. 2 residents stood frozen in the threshold like they were watching a car accident through thick glass. Dr. Patterson, the night attending, was somewhere on the 4th floor attending to a post-op patient. The resident on call wouldn't arrive for 40 seconds. Behind them, the monitor was screaming a rhythm that meant the patient's blood pressure was collapsing and his oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone thrown into dark water. The colonel's chest was heaving asymmetrically. His left side was barely moving. His lips had gone from pink to slate gray in the time it took her to process the room. His eyes were open and aware, which meant he was conscious enough to know he was dying, and that mattered. The trick here was deviated. The breath sounds on the left were absent. She'd seen this exact configuration before, in a field hospital in Paktia province when a Marine caught shrapnel through the lung cavity, and she'd seen it again in a training scenario in 2019, and she was seeing it now. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung, collapsing blood vessels, stopping the heart through sheer mechanical suffocation. She had 2 minutes. Katie moved past the frozen residents like they were furniture. "Get me a 14-gauge catheter," she said, and her voice had changed. The deferential tone she'd been careful to maintain for 6 months, the one that said "I'm just helping, Dr. had dropped away entirely. What emerged was command register. What emerged was Captain Rodriguez in a uniform nobody here had ever seen. Now. Not in 60 seconds. Now. One of the residents, the taller one with acne scars, stammered something about protocols, about waiting for Dr. Patterson, about scope of practice. Katie was already counting ribs with her fingers, palpating the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line. His lung is collapsed. He's in cardiac arrest in 30 seconds. Move or get out of my way. The second resident moved. He went to the crash cart. His hands didn't shake, which meant he'd trained well. The 14-gauge angiocath needle appeared in her hand like it had always been there, muscle memory speaking in a language deeper than thought. Her fingers found the landmark. The space between ribs 2 and 3. The needle went in at 90 degrees and she felt the slight resistance of the pleura, then the release, then the hiss. The hiss of pressurized air escaping. The hiss of a man getting his lung back. She could feel the tension releasing through her fingertips. The needle stayed in place. The catheter remained. The colonel's chest expanded, the left side finally rising with his breath, finally participating in the business of staying alive. The grey was draining from his lips. Color was returning. The monitor began its recovery, the heart rate dropping from 130 to 98, the blood pressure climbing from 68/42 back to a number that meant something, the oxygen saturation rising from 64% to 78 to 84 to 90 and stabilizing there. Sinus rhythm. For minutes had passed since she walked through the door. The colonel was alive because she had moved faster than the system was designed to move. Katie didn't move. Her hand remained steady on the catheter, applying gentle pressure, her other hand maintaining the dressing she'd already placed from the crash cart supplies. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't breathing hard. She was doing the next thing, and the next thing, which was why catastrophe hadn't written itself across this patient's chart in permanent ink. Through the glass partition, she could see the night shift gathered like an audience. The respiratory therapist. 2 nurses from the floor below. An intern she didn't know. The security guard from the ER entrance. All of them watching. All of them silent. All of them understanding what they'd just witnessed, not a miracle, but its practical alternative. Competence. Precision. Someone who moved like they'd already seen the worst the body could do and had decided not to accept it. Dr. Mercer arrived 10 minutes later when the colonel's vital signs had stabilized into a rhythm that suggested he might actually survive the night. Mercer's face was flushed. His shirt collar was bunched on one side like he'd dressed in the dark. His eyes moved from the colonel to the 4 lines to the chest dressing to Katie, and his jaw tightened in a way that suggested he understood exactly what had happened and exactly what he was going to do about it. "That's a physician-level intervention," he said, and there was an edge in his voice like broken glass. "You exceeded your scope of practice. A chest decompression is." 2-minute window, Katie said. She was still holding pressure. She didn't look at him. He would have arrested. "You're 7 minutes away in the best scenario." Regardless of the circumstances, Mercer's voice was rising, "You don't have the authority to." His lung was collapsed. His cardiac output was failing. He had seconds. Now she looked at him. Her eyes were flat. Composed. The eyes of someone who had learned long ago that anger and fear were luxuries that got people killed. "I made the assessment. I performed the decompression. He's alive." That's the end of the conversation. The room went dead silent. Dr. Mercer's face cycled through 3 different colors, red, crimson, then a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was doing the same thing the colonel's had been doing minutes before. His hands clenched and unclenched. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. The words, when they finally came, were quiet, which made them worse than if he'd shouted. "My office. Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. Katie didn't answer. She was already checking the catheter placement, already preparing to call cardiology for monitoring, already moving to the next task because that's what professionals did, they moved. Mercer stood in the doorway for another 3 seconds, watching her work, watching the colonel's monitor climb back to normal, watching the entire night shift pretend they weren't seeing him lose control of a situation in real time. Then he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the rhythm of a man who had just understood that something about his authority had been permanently altered. By morning, Dr. Mercer had made 4 calls. The first was to Dr. Samuel Hayes, a board member who owed Mercer a favor. Some years back, Mercer had quietly suggested that Hayes's daughter's academic struggle at Vanderbilt might be overlooked if certain donations were made, and the girl had somehow managed a passing grade. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Chen at the State Nursing Board, where Mercer mentioned, very casually, that he'd become concerned about credential irregularities in his nursing staff and had questions about one of his employees' references. The third call went to St. Michael's Medical Malpractice Insurer, and Mercer reported that an unlicensed or inadequately trained staff member had performed a physician-level procedure on a patient, potentially creating massive liability exposure. The fourth call went to Katie's 3 listed references. Katie didn't hear about these calls until 6:16 a.m., when HR appeared at her locker with a folder and a manila envelope containing her suspension notice. She was being removed from the schedule pending an external investigation into credential irregularities and scope of practice violations. She would not be permitted to access hospital facilities. She should expect contact from the State Nursing Board within 48 hours. Katie took the envelope. Her hands didn't shake. Her composure remained exactly what it had been at 2:13 a.m., standing over a dying patient with a catheter between his ribs and a room full of witnesses. What they couldn't see, what nobody could see, was the way her entire body had gone cold inside, the way every operational instinct was screaming that this was different from break room whispers and public humiliation. This was institutional. This was coordinated. This was the machinery of actual destruction. She had blown her cover to save a man's life, and now the cover was being destroyed anyway. And that wasn't even the worst part. The termination hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday, 3 days after the colonel's collapse. Katie sat in a grey chair across a mahogany table from 3 hospital administrators and Dr. Mercer, who had arranged a folder in front of him like a surgeon laying out instruments. The folder was thick. Katie noticed the tabs first, color-coded, labeled with dates that stretched back 5 months. Insubordination. Scope of practice violation. Credential irregularities. Each tab held a small stack of papers. The lead administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen with reading glasses on a beaded chain, opened with the tone people used when they'd already made their decision but still needed to perform fairness. "Captain, Ms. Rodriguez, we've reviewed these materials Dr. Mercer has compiled, and we have some serious concerns about your background and your conduct on the unit." Chen's voice was steady, professional. The kind of voice that delivered bad news in a way that felt like no one's fault. Katie sat with her hands folded on the table, palms down, her posture the exact opposite of defensive. Defensive people took up space. Defeated people compressed. Dr. Mercer leaned forward. His jaw had that tight quality it always did when he was building toward something. "Her references don't hold up. When I called the number listed for her previous supervisor at Methodist Atlanta, the woman said she'd never heard of her. Never. I have the call recorded." He tapped the folder. "That suggests either credential fraud or, at minimum, falsification of employment history. In medicine, that's disqualifying." It wasn't true. Katie's references were solid, scrubbed clean, compartmentalized, held by people with classified clearances who would corroborate her story if anyone with the right security level asked. But they wouldn't ask. That was the point. Her handler had made that clear during their last secure communication, the one Katie received through an encrypted message on a burner phone that she'd already destroyed. "Do not defend yourself. Do not explain. Any explanation leads to questions that lead to exposure." Let them think what they want to think. We also have concerns about her direct insubordination toward Dr. Mercer, added Thomas Wells, the hospital's chief medical officer, a man whose expensive watch, a Rolex Submariner, Katie noticed, the kind with a waiting list, clicked softly as he shuffled papers. She corrected your dosage in front of an intern. That's a breach of professional hierarchy. There's also this incident in front of the Morrison family, where she was dismissive of your clinical judgment. Katie didn't blink. She'd practiced this over 6 years, the ability to sit in a room while men rewrote her actions as character flaws. In the Hindu Kush, when her team was pinned by sniper fire and she'd ordered a junior medic to ignore command structure and extract the wounded under covering fire, that was called leadership. Here it was called insubordination. Context didn't matter when context required security clearances to explain. Dr. Mercer's voice dropped, taking on the false sympathy that preceded a knife. I've also requested an external HR investigation into whether her nursing credentials were legitimate. I think that's appropriate given these questions. St. Michael's has a reputation to protect. He smiled at Patricia Chen like they were partners in something noble. The external investigation. That was the real weapon. Not the folder of complaints, those were theater. The investigation was the mechanism that would force background checks, credential verification calls, inquiries to the Vermont Board of Nursing, contact with references who might slip up despite their training. It would generate federal oversight questions that would ping Katie's classified files at the DoD level. Which meant the operation would be exposed. Which meant 6 years of embedded surveillance, of documenting the procurement officer's hospital supply fraud network, of enduring humiliation and isolation and systematic professional destruction. All of it would collapse. Katie had run the timeline with her handler exactly 48 hours ago. They had 2 more weeks. 14 days until they had enough evidence to move against the procurement officer, enough documentation of the supply diversion scheme to coordinate with the FBI. 14 days, and then she could disappear back into active duty or into retirement or into whatever came after. But an external investigation would take 4 days. Maybe 5. The investigation would flag her federal clearance, which would ping Defense Intelligence Agency records, which would alert her handler's supervisor, which would. No. She couldn't think past that point. Her training didn't allow it. Ms. Rodriguez, we're going to place you on immediate suspension pending the outcome of that investigation, Patricia Chen said. The word suspension was gentle. It was meant to be kind. If the investigation clears you, you're welcome back. If it doesn't, we'll be forced to terminate your employment. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you expected. Except Katie had expected exactly this. She'd expected something worse. She'd expected to be dragged in front of the medical board, reported to the state, her name circulated through Savannah's medical community as a credential fraud. She'd expected to lose everything. That was the bargain she'd made when she accepted the embedded assignment. Mission comes first, identity is secondary, career is expendable. I understand, Katie said. The words were quiet. Deferential. She sounded like the person they thought she was, a community college nurse in over her head, caught in a lie, accepting consequence. What she didn't say was, I performed emergency needle decompression on attention pneumothorax in 4 seconds while residents watched from the doorway, recognizing an open pneumothorax by the subtle shift in subcutaneous emphysema under the patient's skin and understanding that air in the pleural space was compressing his heart. I've done this 47 times in field conditions with no monitors and no lights and no backup. I've done this while people were trying to kill me. You are watching someone apologize for saving a life because breaking cover would mean watching 6 years of work evaporate. Patricia Chen slid a termination form across the table. You're entitled to 2 weeks of severance and continuation of health insurance under COBRA. Security will walk you to your car with your personal items. Security. The word landed like a physical thing. The walk from the administrative office to her locker in the staff break room felt longer than 6 months of shifts. Katie could feel eyes on her, not watching, not staring, but aware. Aware that something was ending. A nurse named Jennifer, who'd sat beside Katie for 6 weeks while Katie ate lunch and listened to Jennifer talk about her daughter's soccer tournament, looked away. A respiratory therapist pretended to check his phone. Pain is data, her instructor had taught her during SEER training. Pain is information. Humiliation was also information. It told her that she'd been transparent enough to matter, invisible enough to dismiss. Her locker was exactly how she'd left it. A spare pair of scrubs. A forgotten stethoscope. The cracked NASA mug that her unit had given her for her birthday in 2019, back when half of them were still alive. The succulent she'd been keeping on her desk, the one nobody knew was dry and dying because she'd missed watering it while working 16-hour shifts. A photo in a plastic sleeve showing 12 soldiers in desert uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders. 4 of their faces had been carefully blacked out with a marker pen. Those were the ones from the ambush. The ones who didn't come back. She put everything in a cardboard box that a security officer named Marcus handed to her without speaking. Marcus was gentle about it, the kind of gentleness that comes from knowing that small decencies matter in moments when dignity is already compromised. He walked her to the lobby, and Katie moved through the space like a ghost, watching people notice her, then consciously notice her. A patient in a wheelchair. A family crowded around the information desk. 2 visitors arguing about visitor hours. None of them understood what they were seeing. They were watching someone carry away 6 months of her life in a cardboard box. The rain started just as she stepped outside, not a storm but a persistent, heavy rain that seemed to fall straight down without wind. Her car was 3 blocks away, parked on a side street, and she walked it without hurrying. The box was growing heavy, not from weight but from what weight meant. A NASA mug. A dying plant. A photograph. These were the only physical things in her possession that proved she'd ever been anyone other than Katie Rodriguez, RN. She didn't drive home. She drove to the bus station at Victory Drive, bought a ticket to nowhere in particular, the 6:53 p.m. to Jacksonville, and then walked back out into the rain. She needed to sit. She needed to think. She needed to figure out whether her handler would abort the operation or push forward, and whether it mattered what she needed because this had never been about what she needed. The bus stop was metal and glass, open to the weather. She sat on the bench, the cardboard box beside her, rain pattering on the aluminum roof above. The street was mostly empty. Savannah at dusk in the rain was a place where people compressed themselves, moved faster, kept their heads down. A delivery truck splashed through a puddle. A woman with a stroller jogged toward cover. Headlights blurred through the rain, and Katie stared at them, watching the way light diffracted through water. Her secure phone, the one her handler had given her, the one with no battery to trace, no connection to anything, hadn't buzzed. That silence meant something. It meant they didn't know yet. It meant she still had hours, maybe a day, before the hospital's background audit flagged her file and set off every alarm at Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters. It meant she could still walk away right now, dump the phone in the harbor, disappear into Jacksonville or Atlanta or anywhere else, become someone else's problem. She looked at the photograph through the plastic sleeve. The faces that were crossed out had names: Rodriguez, Harmon, Chen, Wallace. Not dead, not in the way that mattered for official records. They were listed as a missing, presumed captured because one of them, Harmon, had survived. Had told the insurgents about the convoy's route. Had been turned. Katie had learned this 6 months after the ambush, had learned it during a secure briefing that explained why the investigation had gone sideways, why some of her team's names had quietly disappeared from casualty rosters, why she'd been reassigned to embedded intelligence work instead of back to active duty. She wondered if 6 years was long enough to earn back the trust she'd lost. She wondered if it mattered. She wondered what happened to people who sacrificed their identity to stop one corrupt hospital official when that sacrifice turned out to be for nothing. The bus for Jacksonville pulled up to the stop. The driver, a woman with kind eyes, looked at Katie through the rain. "You getting on?" Katie looked at the bus. She looked at the cardboard box. She looked at the rain. She didn't move. "Next one's in 47 minutes, the driver said, and pulled away. Katie sat alone at a rain-soaked bus stop in Savannah, Georgia, holding a cardboard box containing everything she had become, and waited for a phone that might never ring to tell her that everything she'd sacrificed had been worth something other than nothing. The audit flag came through at 4:36 a.m. on a Tuesday. Routine background check. Katie Rodriguez's classified security clearance pinged federal databases like a bell no one expected to ring. The hospital's compliance officer stared at the screen. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. Then that supervisor called the hospital administrator. By 6:53 a.m., 3 people in the building knew the truth, and none of them worked in nursing. The colonel had made his calls the night before. From his hospital bed, still tethered to monitors, he'd used a phone his physical therapist smuggled past the desk, a Pentagon direct line that hadn't seen daylight in 3 years. "Angel 6 is compromised," he'd said. That was all. Within 18 hours, the machinery of institutional power began to move in a direction Dr. Mercer couldn't see coming, couldn't predict, couldn't weaponize with phone calls to board members who suddenly weren't returning his messages. The rehiring ceremony was scheduled for 2:51 p.m. in the main atrium. No one told Katie. She was home. She was sitting on her apartment floor surrounded by unpacked boxes, NASA mug still wrapped in newspaper, the succulent wilting on the windowsill, the photograph of her unit with half the faces crossed out in black marker sitting face down on the coffee table. She had begun making phone calls to contract agencies. She had begun updating her resume. She had begun the quiet work of disappearing again, the way she'd been trained to do, erasing the identity of Captain Overwatch, folding Katie Rodriguez back into the space where no one would find her. The hospital administrator's assistant knocked on her apartment door at 1:15 p.m. Katie answered with her hand on the door frame, blocking entry, jaw tight. "You need to come back," the assistant said. "Now." "Main atrium." "Don't ask questions." Katie didn't change her clothes. She didn't shower. She walked into St. Michael's Hospital still wearing the same grey shirt she'd slept in, still wearing the scrubs pants with a hole in the left knee, still carrying the weight of 6 years that had been treated like a mistake. The atrium was packed. 200 staff members. Administrators in pressed suits. A Marine in dress blue standing at a podium. Hospital security had blocked off the central floor. Katie stopped at the entrance, confused, her hand instinctively reaching for an exit route, muscle memory, operational training, the part of her that was always calculating angles and escape vectors. Then she saw him. The colonel was in his wheelchair. His chest was still wrapped, his left arm still in a sling from the cardiac surgery, but his eyes were locked on her across 200 bodies and fluorescent-lit distance. He stood. His hands shook as he gripped the wheelchair arms and pushed upright, his physical therapist moving to catch him if he fell, but he was already upright, already steady, already standing on legs that 6 days ago couldn't hold his own weight. He looked at Katie from across that atrium and said her call sign in a voice that carried like a command, "Captain Overwatch." The room went dead silent. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, and into that humming quiet, the colonel's voice hung like a bell that had been rung. The Marine at the podium stepped forward. He was older, 50-something, with the bearing of someone who had seen catastrophe and chosen dignity anyway. He opened a leather folder. "Captain Rodriguez," he began, and his voice was the voice of institutional memory. "For extraordinary valor during Operation Mountain Sweep. Captain Rodriguez performed 27 trauma surgeries under sustained enemy fire, saving 418 lives in a forward surgical team environment that was, by all measures, survivable only by those trained for it. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 Silver Star." And he paused, and that pause was the sound of history recognizing itself, 1 Navy Cross for actions that remain partially classified but resulted in the recovery of 52 missing personnel and the prevention of a Level 4 bioweapon cascade. He read it the way military men read citations, without flourish, without theater, just the weight of facts and valor and a life spent becoming invisible so others could live. Dr. Mercer shoved through the crowd. He was shouting before his voice had clearance. This is completely irregular. This violates protocol. Chain of command. I have documentation. I have. His face was crimson. The vein in his temple pulsed visibly. His hands were clenched into fists. This was not a man having a professional objection. This was a man watching the ground beneath him collapse and clawing for something, anything, to hold on to. She fabricated her credentials. I have the State Nursing Board report. I initiated the investigation. Whatever this is, it's procedurally invalid. Then the doors at the far end of the atrium opened. A two-star general walked through. Not escorted. Not announced. Just present suddenly, the way authority moves when it doesn't need permission. She was in dress blues, her chest a riot of ribbons, 3 across the top, each one representing decisions made, losses absorbed, wars that had names and wars that didn't. She was wearing the kind of uniform that made the atrium air pressure change. She walked directly to Katie, looked at her face, looked at the ribbon rack Katie wasn't wearing, the medals that had been locked in a safe deposit box for 3 years, the honors that had never been pinned to her civilian chest. The general saluted. A full salute. Arm bent at 90 degrees, fingers extended, held for 2 seconds like a prayer. Then she unpinned the commendation medal from her own dress uniform and fastened it to Katie's scrub shirt. The same scrub shirt with a hole in the knee. The same shirt that had been mopped and scrubbed and sweat-soaked in a hospital where no one knew who wore it. On behalf of the Joint Chiefs, the general said, "Welcome home, Captain." The applause started somewhere in the back. It wasn't enthusiastic. It was confused. But it was there. 200 people clapping because a 2-star general had just saluted a nurse in scrubs, and institutional power had no choice but to follow. Then a man in a charcoal suit stepped from behind the Marine. Pentagon credentials. Congressional authorization letter. The kind of official who doesn't show up for routine hospital ceremonies. He stood next to Katie and spoke quietly, but in the atrium's acoustics, the words carried like an announcement, Nightingale Protocol. Black site assignment. Embedded operative. Procurement fraud investigation. You maintained your cover for 6 years. The investigation is complete. The charges are filed. You're extracted. He turned to face the hospital administrators. Captain Rodriguez was assigned here by order of Joint Force Command. Her presence at this facility was military necessity. Any investigation into her credentials was interference with classified operation. That investigation is now closed. He looked directly at Dr. Mercer. Pending review. Dr. Mercer's face went grey. The crimson drained like someone had opened a valve. Hospital IT specialist Chen approached Administrator Walsh with a laptop. Chen was Navy, you could tell by the way he moved, the precise economy of motion, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. I found something, he said quietly. Server logs. Unauthorized access. Dr. Mercer deleted files. Doctored timestamps. I archived everything. He turned the laptop so they could see, timestamp 11:16 p.m., Dr. Mercer's credentials, Katie's personnel file opening. Then her file being copied. Then her file being altered. Then sections deleted. Then the deletion log being purged. Then Dr. Mercer logging back in at 2:33 a.m. to make sure he'd covered his tracks. The screen showed his face illuminated by monitor light, his expression focused, methodical, the expression of someone who had done this before, who had the technical expertise to corrupt systems, who believed he was untouchable. He tried to hide it, Chen said. But once you know what you're looking for, it's all still there. His voice was steady. I recognized what he was doing. I've seen officers bury enlisted personnel before. I don't let that happen anymore. The hospital attorney was already on her phone. The administrator was already standing. The board members were already looking away from Dr. Mercer, their expressions shifting from confusion to calculation, calculating distance, calculating how quickly they could reassure themselves they'd never supported him, never trusted him, never really known him at all. By 4:24 p.m., termination documents were drafted. By 5:16 p.m., security escorted Dr. Mercer from the building. He was carrying a cardboard box. Inside it were things he'd accumulated in his office over 15 years, a framed diploma from Johns Hopkins, another diploma from Harvard Medical, a coffee mug that said "World's Best Doctor" in hand-painted letters, a photo of his family at a beach house, a paperweight made from obsidian that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. He walked through the same lobby where he'd humiliated Katie in front of a grieving family. Staff members studied their phones as he passed. No one met his eyes. No one said goodbye. Katie stood in the atrium and watched him leave through the glass doors. She was still in her scrubs. The commendation medal was still pinned to her chest. The general was still standing beside her. The colonel was back in his wheelchair but smiling in the way men smile when they've seen justice arrive in dress blues and Pentagon authorization. Katie's expression didn't change. Her jaw was set. Her eyes tracked Mercer across the parking lot to the security escort vehicle. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't satisfaction. This was the look of someone who had endured the worst of what institutional power could deliver and remained standing. This was the look of a soldier watching the enemy retreat. "He never saw who you really were," the colonel said quietly. Katie didn't look away from the glass. "He saw exactly who I was," she said. "He just thought it made me weak." The commendation medal caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in white-hot reflection. In that moment, in that atrium, with 200 witnesses and a 2-star general and a Marine citation and a Pentagon authorization and an entire hospital realizing they had made a catastrophic error in judgment, Katie Rodriguez was no longer invisible. The nurse uniform had been a costume. The military insignia was the truth. The cardboard box she'd carried away from that firing had been temporary, a chrysalis, not a grave. And now, stepping out of it, she was something that no amount of institutional power could diminish, a warrior, recognized, restored, and absolutely unbroken. If you made it this far, you understand that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and the quietest people in the room might just be the ones holding everything together. Subscribe for more stories like this, hit that like button, and drop a comment. What would you have done in Katie's position? Would you have stayed silent to protect the mission, or would you have broken cover to defend yourself?